All right, good morning and welcome back. Today we're going to do Chapter 12, Section 2. We're going to talk about Jackson's policy towards the Native Americans. And this is going to be a huge atrocity in the United States, and it's going to be one of the worst things that the United States ever does. Native Americans in the Southeast. Now, since the 1600s, white settlers had pushed Native Americans westward as they took their land. You know, there's always been this, from the time that the Mayflower, from the time that the Jamestown people showed up, they're pushing Native Americans off their land. And there's just this constant move to go westward, and as the Americans, or colonists at the time, now the Americans, are moving westward, it forces more and more people off their land. Some whites hoped that Native Americans that remained could adapt to the white people's way of life, but most wanted them to leave. They wanted their land. So if they're still on the land, you can't have it. So they're trying to, a lot of the people, they just are simply attempting to get the Native Americans out of the land. By the 1820s, only about 100,000 Native Americans remained east of the Mississippi River, most in the southeast. So most of them are in the southeast, and they're all part of what are called the 5 civilized tribes: the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminoles. They were known as the 5 civilized tribes because many of them actually adopted mannerisms and acting like Americans. So the Native Americans had kind of began to adopt the ways of white Americans at the time. So because of that, they're called the 5 civilized tribes. Now, the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee had mostly adopted white customs. As you can see, Sequoia, he's dressed for the most part like a white man, except he's got the turban on his head. He actually created a written language. And from that, they created what was called the Cherokee Phoenix, which is a newspaper. And they also created a constitution based on the U.S. Constitution. You're talking about people who had no idea how to read. He didn't know how to read. He creates an alphabet for the Cherokee language based kind of on the U.S. alphabet, on the American alphabet. And then, within a year, he teaches almost the whole entire tribe how to read. This is a massive feat. And as you can see, they're, for lack of a better term, they're Americanizing themselves. They're becoming more like the white citizens. The problem is that you have people who are always going to be bigoted towards them simply because they're not white, and you're going to find gold on their land, which they're going to want to push them off. A year after the Cherokee created their constitution, gold was discovered on their land in Georgia, and whites began to push for their removal. Now, Jackson's removal policy. Andrew Jackson had long supported moving Native Americans west of the Mississippi. You know, Jackson for a long time was actually an Indian commissioner. And when he was doing that, he did a lot of cheating the Native Americans out of their lands, and doing so, giving himself and a lot of his friends some of the best lands in the South. Working as Indian Treaty Commissioner after the War of 1812, Jackson forced treaties on the Native Americans, forcing them to give up much of their land. Jackson believed that the government could control where Native Americans lived and thought they had 2 choices: adopt American lifestyles and become citizens, or move west. The problem is his idea that they could adopt and become American citizens. Most other whites didn't have that feeling, at least the ones in the South. So that really puts a damper on some of his thoughts in that. The thing is that Andrew Jackson had actually fought with Native Americans, and some of the Cherokee had later said that had fought alongside him and said, if I would have known he was going to do this to us back then when I fought with him, I would have killed him myself. When gold was discovered, whites began to move on to Cherokee lands, and the southern states began to pass laws allowing them to take over Cherokee lands. So this land that is by law Cherokee land, the state of Georgia starts saying, no, that's too bad. You know what? That's not your land anymore. That's going to be these people's land. When the Native Americans protested, Jackson sided with the states. This was one of the things I said that Jackson did wrong. This was totally blatant, and he actually overstepped his bounds and did things that were illegal, that he wasn't even supposed to be able to do. Now, basically what happens is these Native Americans, these Cherokee, they do the right thing. They take it to the courts. They actually go to the Supreme Court to try to fight this removal, and the Supreme Court sides with the Native Americans. Jackson asked Congress to pass a law that would force Native Americans to either move west or submit to state laws. Edward Everett opposed moving Native Americans against their will, stating they would face the perils and hardships of a wilderness. You know, a lot of the people in Congress and Jackson himself, they said, how is this not fair? We're trading them the exact type of land, or the exact amount of land we're taking from them. We're giving them that and even more land. So they're giving them land in Oklahoma territory. The problem is the lands where these people live and have lived for thousands of years is nothing like the land that they're going to give them. In fact, the land that they're going to give them is almost like a desert and land that they are not equipped to survive in. After heated debates, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act in 1830. Jackson thought his policy was just and liberal and would allow Native Americans to keep their way of life. So he's not seeing, he doesn't have the foresight, he's not understanding that you're sending them to lands that they're not capable of living on or that they've never lived on. So he thinks what he did is actually an okay thing. Now, the Trail of Tears. As whites poured in, many Native Americans saw no choice but to trade their land for land in the West. Oklahoma and parts of Kansas and Nebraska became known as the Indian Territory. So this red that you're seeing here on the map was designated Indian Territory. Most tribes began to leave in the fall of 1831, but the Cherokee first appealed to the Supreme Court to protect their land, like I said. So this is why the Cherokee are going to be removed later, and it's going to be a huge, a lot of Cherokee are going to die. In 1832, the court ruled that only the federal government, not the states, could make laws governing the Cherokee. So you can see that the Cherokee, they actually win the court case, according to the Supreme Court. Georgia and President Jackson ignored the order. Jackson stated, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. So what he's saying is, yeah, John Marshall made a decision, the court made a decision, but they don't have the military power to enforce it, so I'm just going to do whatever I want. So he basically goes against what the Supreme Court deems as constitutional, and he just decides to do whatever he wants instead. Totally against the Constitution, should have been overridden, never was. Now, a small group of Cherokee gave up and moved west, but the majority, led by John Ross, this is John Ross, who was the chief of the Cherokee at the time, opposed the treaty. In 1838, federal troops commanded by General Winfield Scott, this is going to be the black mark in Winfield Scott's tenure. Actually, General Winfield Scott was one of the greatest war heroes in American history, but through this, it puts a black mark on him. There were actually 7 other commanding generals that they asked to do it first. They all said no, they wouldn't do it until they got to Winfield Scott. And he always did what he was told to do, so he just did it. Were rounded up, so they rounded up about 16,000 Cherokees and forced them into camps. Basically what they did is they came to the house, with fixed bayonets and loaded guns, and they said, you have 5 minutes to grab anything you can possibly grab, and you get out the door. And they took them like that, and they herded them up into mini camps, and then they started forcing them west. So a lot of the people only had the clothes that were on their backs, and now they're going to actually do this march during the wintertime. Around 4,000 or 1/4 of the Cherokee died on the trip, and the harsh journey became known as the Trail of Tears. So there was a little bit of resistance. Not all Cherokee left. A man named Tassali refused to go, and he and his grown sons killed a soldier and escaped. Now, this is the way they tell the story, is that Tassali and his grown sons killed a soldier. What really happened was some of the soldiers were actually trying to attack his daughter. They defended the daughter. The soldier was killed. So they actually they fled and found other Cherokee in the Great Smoky Mountains. The army followed them. They were told to surrender. Tassali and his sons were told if they surrendered, then they would allow the rest of the Cherokee that were in there already to stay there, so they did. And then they executed Tassali and all of his sons except for his youngest son, who was 10 years old. In 1835, the Seminoles refused to leave Florida, and this led to the Second Seminole War. The Seminoles were the only Native American tribe to never submit. They never signed a treaty. They never gave up. And they still live in the Everglades to this day. One of the most important leaders was Osceola. He would hide in the Everglades and use surprise attacks to defeat the U.S. in many battles, so guerrilla warfare. He was tricked into capture when he came to peace talks in 1837 and eventually died in prison. But the rest of the Seminoles fought on, moving deeper into the Everglades where their descendants live today. This down here is Chief Black Hawk. North of the Ohio, other groups resisted, and a Sauk Chief Black Hawk led a resistance that was eventually crushed. Chief Black Hawk and the Sauk and Fox tribe, they actually went to Indian Territory, got there, said this place is terrible. He led them back. When they got back, there were already people who had came in and taken their land, basically. They killed a few families. A war broke out, and the Sauk and Fox were forced to retreat. They tried to head for Canada. They were eventually captured in Wisconsin, and basically when they were crossing the Mississippi River, they were slaughtered. Now, that is it for Chapter 12, Section 2. If you have any questions, get a hold of me. Make sure you're doing the work. Have a great day.